If we could go to another subject and back to something you mentioned earlier, your strong support of the Westminster system, and we obviously see that Parliament has been captured by a two-party system, not just a normal two-party system, but the cabal that they've created means that the parties are no longer open and transparent and democratic. And in a book that I wrote a couple of years ago called Give Us Back Our Country, I proposed that there should be a provision, that a law, or perhaps even a constitutional provision, that in return for the vast cornucopia of financial and legal advantage which the parties have, in return for that, they should be committed to be open and transparent and democratic. And if they don't want to be open, transparent and democratic, they should forego all the money they get. They get an enormous amount in each election. They get exemptions from privacy laws and in relation to the electoral laws. They're a tremendous advantage. They've awarded themselves tremendous advantages and then they've abused it.
I did some back of the sums envelopes, and I just back real quickly. It's $100 million of taxpayers' money. Both the big two parties award themselves from taxpayers' funds to run their election campaigns. And
they've stopped the very small parties from getting anything, because I think you've got to get 4%. First preferences, haven't you? Yes, you don't get that. So that means that the parties who really need it don't get anything.
And they said you've got to have 15 now. They've clicked the number up to 1,500 registered members. Yes. They also passed legislation that says, gives them like a monopoly right to the name. So the Democratic Labor Party, who have been around since the 50s, is that right? Right. Can't use their name in this next election, right?
Really?
Yeah, that's right. The Liberal Democratic Party, that have been around for 30 odd years or something, 20, they can't use that name. So it's not as though someone's just plucked the name out of thin air to use to try and, names that have been around for decades of political parties, small political parties, can't be used. The 1,500 member rule has knocked a lot of these smaller parties out. So that's also one of the reasons why that I felt I had no alternative than to join and work with the United Australia Party, because we're going to have the firepower to take these guys on.
Getting to another subject, the Constitution. I believe you're a constitutional monarchist.
Yes,
that
absolutely.
You believe in the existing system.
Yeah, well, it's shaken me up a bit the last 2 years, but I think it's because we haven't been following the Constitution, and some of the decisions that have been made just defy logic. The states now, what about provision of trade, commerce and intercourse between the states shall be not free, absolutely free, right? So they sat down when they were writing the Constitution and thought, let's put that word absolutely in so there can be no question about it, right? And today, I can't travel to Queensland. I can't travel across the border to South Australia.
Well, it was completely unjustified to have these statewide lockdowns. I think lockdowns are unjustified. You might be able to say in a small area, perhaps we should be very careful in that small area, but to have a whole state in a lockdown it's unacceptable. But these were underwritten by the federal government.
Correct.
Underwritten financially, correct. Underwritten by not going to the High Court. In fact, the Prime Minister pulled out of the case brought by Clive Palmer. He pulled out of that case. He was supporting that case. I think the federal government should have been policing as far as they could, Section 92, that is.
Well, one thing that really disturbed me was to see the Australian Defence Force put on those borders to enforce those state government regulations that denied trade, commerce and intercourse across state boundaries. That to me was using the Australian Defence Force to act in ways that I thought were in violation of the Constitution, and that disturbed me deeply. I spoke about that amongst a few colleagues and sort of no one seemed to care about it. I just thought this is a fundamental principle of our federation, not only the economic costs that we've done to it. So the fundamental principle, maybe there was some argument on the quarantine basis, especially at first when where you didn't know how transmissible it was, when still there was a lot of things not unknown. But to have today a decision that I, as someone that has decided not to be injected and not participate in the medical experiment, to be denied access to go into Queensland is abhorrent. It is just so wrong. It is such a violation of our constitution, and it's been done by politicians because they see short-term votes and they are trying to work out a way to justify of running up this $1 trillion debt that we now have and spending all this money and having all these vaccine mandates that we now see the evidence doesn't justify.
If we go back into the history of our country, particularly the move to federation, the first attempts at federation, well, the British tried to propose it and the local politicians rejected it. But when Australians started showing an interest in the late 19th century in federation, the first convention produced a draft constitution, but it then went back to the 6 colonial parliaments, who then quibbled about it. They couldn't agree among themselves. And it was at Corowa, at a private conference, a conference of people at Corowa, where Sir John Quick came up with the Corowa Plan. It's been called the Corowa Plan since. And that was the next convention should be elected by the people, and also that when it had come to a conclusion, a draft constitution, and consulted heavily with the people and with the state politicians, colonial politicians, it should then be put to the people directly. And that was the extraordinary thing. It was an enormous achievement, because once they started applying the Corowa Plan, which was about 1896, they got through referendums. There had to be 2 because of New South Wales being a little ornery. Yes. And they got through referendums in 5 states, took the constitution to London, got it quickly through the British Parliament. The whole process, and they had to wait on the West Australians, who were a bit slow, but the whole process took 4 years. Now, we can't lay a tram track down George Street in 4 years. Now, that was an extraordinary thing. I think the special ingredient was the people. The people had the final say. Yes. And I think when the High Court talks about on whom is the authority of the Constitution, they say, well, the people are sovereign, but then they don't apply it when they come to some of their judgments. There was a great statesman in the 18th century, Bolingbroke, who said, because the British don't have a written single document constitution, he said, by constitution we mean that assembly of laws, customs and institutions by which the people have agreed to be governed. The people have agreed to be governed. And I think that's the whole base. That should be the basis of the Constitution. And we should be more regularly going to the people, I think. And the people, I think, should have much more control over the politicians. For example, through recall elections. Yes. And through, I believe that they should have the power to, with a decent percentage in a petition, they should have the power to initiate referendums. Referendums shouldn't be the preserve of the federal government, because the federal government and the federal parliament the only times they go to the people is to ask for more powers. That's right. They don't have to anymore because the High Court has, in most instances, given them anyway.
Look, a couple of areas I think that I don't think the Constitution let us down is not the right words, but where I think our policy has let us down, I think, is the issue of free speech. I think we should have some maybe stronger provisions like the Americans have in their Bill of Rights. I think we've got to enshrine free speech a lot greater. I think especially in the age of these large tech giants that have so much control over what goes into the media. Like people talk about the Murdoch media having so much control. They have nothing like the control that Facebook and YouTube do. Like we've seen, not only did Facebook take down my entire platform, but YouTube have deleted from the internet, from their platform, speeches that I've given in Parliament. So I've given a speech on the floor of the Parliament, goes in the Hansard. Remember, they don't, those beautiful green books they used to print up with all the Hansard, they no longer print those. So what's written down, what's recorded in the videos of these things are almost becoming a de facto Hansard. So, but what I say on the floor of Parliament, now I have to think, when I go into Parliament, I have to think, well, if I say these certain words, will YouTube delete this? As a member of Parliament, to speak on the floor, I should be able to free to say whatever I want to say.
Isn't that a breach of the privilege of Parliament, as we discussed on another occasion?
I argued that with the Speaker, the former Speaker, Tony Smith. I made an appeal to Speaker Smith that having speeches on the floor of Parliament deleted from YouTube was a breach of the Parliamentary Privileges Act. He didn't even think, he seemed to disagree. But look, there's more evidence that has come through since, and his argument was, we've got other ways of getting that information out. Well, now I've been shut down on Facebook, I've been shut down on YouTube. Even the Chinese-run TikTok have cancelled my account. We know TikTok is, and I just did that for a bit of fun, because it's a lot of young people. We've got to get our message out to. I did a video, and all it was photographs of these rallies that we had with our yellow signs with the word freedom, freedom, freedom written on, backgrounded to one of the music with a song called, That's Freedom. Right? And somehow or other the Chinese that run the TikTok Chinese communists didn't like it. Right? They didn't like all these signs that said freedom, freedom, freedom. So that video was censored from TikTok, and my entire TikTok account was taken down. So we've got this enormous control from these big tech giants about what can be said. It's also controlling other groups like Sky News. And I know a lot of other independent media commentators that they use YouTube and Facebook to post their interviews and their media commentary up. They know there are certain areas that they talk about which are often contrary to the economic interests of those companies, that they will have their platforms taken down. Now, I think we need a law in this country, and also in many other Western countries, that where we have these large tech giants that have such control over the media, if it is lawful to be said, it is unlawful for them to take it down off a platform.
They claim not to be publishers. Well, they're publishers, but they claim not to be.
Well, they're not. You can't have it both ways. You can't promote yourself as an open platform, and so now we want all the protections of a publisher. It's almost like the old town square where you get your soapbox up, right, and you stood on your soapbox, the old town square, and you had free speech. You could argue whatever political argument that you wanted to. Facebook and YouTube today have taken the role of the old town square. Now, if they've got the right to say who goes into the town square and who's allowed to stand up on their soapbox and who's allowed to speak and who's not allowed to speak, this is no longer a free and democratic society. So this is one thing I think we need. That was obviously something in our Constitution. When I wrote that Constitution back in the late 1890s, they would have never envisaged something like that. So we have to deal with that. I think we also need to deal with the human rights issue. Now, the fact that we've had people lose their jobs, not only their jobs, their careers, because they have not wanted to undergo a medical intervention, right? That's actually contrary to the human rights international treaties that we have signed. There's the International Treaty of, it's Universal Declaration of Bioethics and Human Rights, Article 7, sets it out in black and white. You can't use coercion to enforce someone to undergo a medical intervention with threats of prejudice or disadvantage. And that's exactly what we're doing. Prejudice or disadvantage means, it's not coercion, it's blackmail and extortion. With threats that you will lose we will not allow you to earn an income, and not only will throw you out of your job, but in your career of choice will not allow you to work. That is blackmail and coercion that is being used against Australian citizens to force them to undergo a medical intervention. Now that is just unethical, it is immoral, and it is just simply wrong. Now the fact that we've got politicians in Canberra that don't think it's wrong, they shouldn't be there. And if they do think it's wrong, they're not prepared to speak up. They don't belong there. And I believe we have to get that enshrined somewhere in our laws so that this can never happen again.
And provided that we also vest an enormous amount of control in the people so that this isn't just left to the courts to decide. We've seen in the United States, for example, how the Supreme Court has in many ways invented aspects of the law. For example, they've completely invented a constitutional right to abortion, which is a state matter. It's not. It's for the states to decide what should happen. One of the things that I think emerged strongly in this epidemic is that the states seem to be so dominated by the capital cities. Queensland, for example, because Brisbane's getting bigger and bigger, and the southeast Queensland is bigger. And Queensland is an excellent example where there's been a very long argument. It preceded federation, a strong argument that the north and the centre should be separate states. I would think that if people want to form a separate state, they should be allowed to do that, because the centralisation which has occurred, because the governments, it's strange, since the Hawke government, governments have refused to harvest water. They won't build dams. There can be no development without dams, so that when you have migration, particularly large mass migration, as we've had in recent years, the migrants are forced to come to Sydney, Melbourne, or Brisbane. There's no point going anywhere else because the jobs are not there.
You pick up on a very important point that I think needs a major policy change in this nation. I remember when I was growing up, we was told about decentralisation, and there was the Albury-Wodonga development area, right? Well, we were taught about this at school. That seems to have been thrown out. Now it seems to be a policy of centralisation in Sydney. So we just go up and up and up and up, and we build more and more towers, and we end up looking like Shenzhen, parts of Sydney.
Yes, you said that in your maiden speech.
Yes.
You talked about the ridiculous plan to make Sydney a city of 7 million.
Well, more than that, more than 7 million. Like, I get in my car and drive down to Canberra, and you get past there at Campbelltown, and there's just hundreds, thousands and thousands of acres of just open land. Right? And you go to Goulburn, the city of Goulburn, and you see the potential development there. And then you come to the first suburbs of northern Canberra. These blocks of land, they're built on 300 square metres. It's tiny, tiny little blocks of land. Houses. What are you people doing here? What sort of quality of life? And one thing that I think that was great that we had about Australia was kids were able to have a backyard where they could run and they could play and they could get outside. And there was a paper I read maybe 5, 6 years ago. It was called Children of an Urban City. And it talked about how children living in urban environments had less confidence in themselves. They had less hand-eye coordination. They had less manual dexterity. They were less fit than kids that lived in sort of the outer regional areas. So you see kids growing up in these high-rise apartments. We're fortunate. We were blessed with the land that we have. We're trying to concentrate everything in Sydney, and then there's the cost of retrofitting infrastructure. Like, look at the cost of duplicating the M5 here in Sydney. Just extraordinary, billions and billions for a couple of kilometres. Your party would obviously be committed to the Australian dream. That is that everybody should be able to buy their own house if they want to. There are some statistics that I was looking at, and they're federal government statistics, which showed that by income of potential home buyers, 40% of the lowest income are completely priced out of the Sydney and, curiously, Hobart markets. Right. And it's not so good in the other capitals. And this is appalling. Well, there's a unit above my office in Sutherland. Small 2-bedroom unit. It's going to auction. I think I'll get $980,000 for it. Almost $1 million. So you can't buy. Now, the Sutherland Shire in my electorate, what is 50 minutes from the city. You can't buy in there for under $1 million. And you come into some of these inner city places, $1 million will get you nothing. How does a young couple starting off afford a $200,000 deposit and then an $800,000 mortgage? And what happens if interest rates rise? Now, this is... With the debt that the federal government has built up, those interest rates are doomed to rise, particularly with what President Biden is doing. The idea that we're going to have interest rates below 1% for forever is just, that's not going to happen. Now, the other thing I can say what it does to your society, if you turn if you turn a society, and there's obviously times people need to rent and where they're moving things, but if you take away entire generations' dream of home ownership, you fundamentally change the structure of your society. This is where, they was saying your best saving is you force your mortgage. You scrape and you scrounge and you go without and you save and you pay the mortgage, right? If you haven't got a mortgage to pay, why bother? It changes the mentality, but why bother saving? I'll just go out and party all weekend, and there's no point in me saving. There's no point of, and I don't get to own, this sort of one piece of the world that is mine. It's like the great socialist mentality we're getting out of Europe at the moment. You will own nothing and you will be happy. That's so the idea that you don't own anything. Home ownership has so many important values for society. I remember there's a great book I read. It was called, I think, As You Sow. It's a story. It was a study in America, and it was in the 40s, I think, the 40s, 50s. And there were two central Californian towns. They were similar in population, they were similar in size, they were similar in soils, weather, economic output, everything was similar. But the difference was one had a high rate of home ownership and one had a high rate of people that were just transit and renting. And the city that had the higher ownership, by every other social measure that you could do, by juvenile delinquencies and school people going to school and crime rates and the number of parks and things, that town was so much superior. And I believe we will have a superior and better society if we give people the opportunity to own their own homes.
So we have these concentrated markets in Sydney.
So how do we do it? Well, you can't deflate the existing markets because you'll cause chaos and you'll bring on economic recession if you do that, because people will find themselves all of a sudden they've got negative equity in their house. And so many people have borrowed against the value of their house to fund their business. If all of a sudden you have a big collapse in the value of their houses, the banks will go back and say, sorry, you've either got to pay a much higher interest rate, or we want more security, or we want you to repay the loan. So you can't, unfortunately, depress the value of the existing markets. Now, the only way I think you can do it, we've got to strengthen our regional towns. All our regional towns, we've got to give young Australians the opportunity to go and live in a regional town. Now, how do we do that? I think we have a regional taxation policy where if you live in the regions, you pay a lower rate of tax. I think we can move many government departments out to the regions. Now, I know people say, I don't want to move that, but I think if you had, I want to see a lease, a schedule of all leases that the federal government owns in the major capital cities and how long they were on those leases. And I say, so if it's part of the taxation department, okay, how about we move all you guys down to on the south coast to Eden, on Narooma or Nowra or somewhere. Let's say Nowra, okay. Of course, it'll be a 5-year plan. Okay, we'll go ahead and we'll construct a new office tower down in Nowra. So, and that will be leased in 5 years' time. So you create all the work there. Then you bring 1,000 people into that town. You create employment and construction work, and that creates room for restaurants and accountants. And you build the town up that way.
Do we need water?
Of course, you need to. Well, then you've got to make sure you've got the water infrastructure for those towns, which may obviously require building more dams or raising the height of existing dam walls, doing more recycling of water where we can. We know this idea that this is one thing, the drought, remember the drought being permanent?
Yes.
It's flooding down Oregon. What a good old Tim Flannery say, even the rains that fall won't fill the rivers and dams. So I think our dams are overflowing at the moment. Even good old Lake George, driving back from Canberra, was almost full again. But we know our history tells us that we've got these 5 to 10 year cycles, and that will turn around and we'll go back into drought. We've got an abundance of rain at the moment. We know the climate hasn't changed and the rain will stay like it all the time. We know we will go back into a period of drought. So we've got to make sure that these regional towns we have the water supply, have the infrastructure, have the hospitals. And I think that's the way you've got to do it. So you've got to say to a young couple, there's no reason that you should not be able to buy a house on a quarter-acre block for under $500,000 in a regional town. And where you can also be, mind you might only be 10 minutes, if you're working in that city, 10 minutes away. Your kid's school can be 5 minutes away. If you're in one of these towns on the beach, you can be 5 or 10 minutes from the beach. I think a lot of people in the Sydney would jump at the opportunity to move to, if they knew that these regional towns had the hospital infrastructure, had the transport infrastructure, had the water infrastructure that was there, they would happily move. You could sell your place for $1.5 million in Sydney. You could buy a place that was beyond all luxury for $1 million and put $500,000 in your pocket to go and enjoy it. I think people would jump at that opportunity, but we've got to do it. We can't just try and everyone live and cram people and live like battery hens in these major capital cities. That is something that I think we've really got to try and reverse the direction that we're heading, and that'll be one of the major policies that we're working on at the moment and we take into the next election.
And would you encourage the development of new states if people wanted them?
I think so, yeah. I know in Queensland, up there, I remember that's when Bob Brown went up there. Those northern Queensland, you say they hate the bloody Southerners, and they're only talking about the people from Brisbane, not the people from New South Wales or Victoria. It's how you would do it under the Constitution, how many Senate seats that you would give them are always up for a question. But I think we'd be better with more regional towns. There's the idea that you may get rid of all the states together and just have large regional councils, have a series of large regional councils. That's also one argument that's been discussed. But I think anything that decentralises the power and control, I think is good for our country.